Welcome to TRANSACT Connect. I'd like to thank the ETA for having us and for your continued leadership and support of our industry. I'm Dale Laszig with the Green Sheet, and I'm excited to kick off the Risk, Fraud, and Security track. Our experts will be examining how to quantify cybersecurity risk. And I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. Marc Punzirudu. As Vice President of Security Consulting Services at ControlScan, Marc leads the ControlScan professional services teams at performing risk and compliance, cybersecurity, and technical evaluations for organizations. For the past 15 years, Marc has held leadership and consulting roles with various multinational organizations, specializing in IT operations, security, development, and risk management. Marc holds multiple security-related certifications and credentials, including PCIP, CRISC, CISA, CISM, CISP, and PCI QSA. And I would like to introduce Chris Strand. As Chief Compliance Officer at IntSights, Chris helps companies bridge the gap between cybersecurity and regulatory compliance. With more than 20 years of subject matter expertise in information technology and security audit assessment, Chris specializes in developing enterprise security platforms and markets within hypergrowth organizations. His leadership roles at flagship security companies such as Carbon Black, RSA, and Tripwire have informed his unique insights into data security, forensics, threat intelligence, and solution implementation. Chris is a trained security auditor and PCIP, and actively participates with ISACA, ISSA, ISC Squared, and the PCI Security Council in developing cyber regulations globally. Welcome to you both.
Thanks.
Chris, you've helped numerous organizations quantify cybersecurity risk. Why do you believe it's so important?
Well, Dale, so it goes right in with my mission statement, and it's one that guides me and drives my efforts in the industry. The premise is simply, well, it's not simply, it's quite long, but the premise is essentially, being checkmark compliant doesn't always equal security. We hear that all the time as security people. It doesn't necessarily reduce risk either, but really proactive measure and effective proof of the cybersecurity and security controls will equal the security to know that you're continuously safe from cyber threats and you're aware of your cyber compliance state. So I know that's a mouthful, but basically it points to the premise that, as cybersecurity professionals, we need to utilize and make use of what the compliance guidelines are measuring for us. And that's in order so that we can determine how at risk our security controls are from those cyber threats. And so I think this is of paramount importance to any organization. And this is why I've spent so much of my career both trying to join together the compliance and the security camps together. And compliance is traditionally considered as a separate initiative from the work of securing the enterprise. And I like to try to change that. The intelligence collected from compliance regulation or compliance frameworks usually answers a yes or no type of question during audit. But security is usually, on the other hand, is usually viewed as a tactical solution, the buttons and dials we need to apply against a negative security or static data set. So neither of those traditional views or exercises really lead to quantifying cybersecurity risk. But if you step back at the quantitative intelligence joined together from both of those security and compliance data collection specifics, will demonstrate to us how at risk we are to cyber threats. And in essence, that continues to drive my belief that true measure of cybersecurity policy lies in how effectively the enterprise can quantify their risk to both cyber compliance and those security controls.
Great point. And Mark, you obviously agree and feel the same way as Chris because you initially proposed this topic for discussion.
Yeah, and thank ETA for having me. Like Chris, I'm very much in agreement that operationalizing information security is important. Developing strategy so that you can do it more effectively is quite critical. And when you chase compliance and you do check a bunch of boxes and just hope all is well, those decisions you've made to get there are not very efficient or effective. You have no metrics to measure anything. So I like to use the acronym or the analogy, I should say, that if you're going on a trip in your car, security is your destination. That's where you want to go. Your framework, what is the road you're going to take? Those are the set of roads. Risk is kind of the route that you're going to take to get there, and compliance is just a pit stop. You're stopping to get gas or a sandwich. I think that information security is only as difficult as we make it. We're changing a lot of paradigms and having to explain complex security topics and risk relative topics to individuals who have a business perspective, which is at times very difficult. So the idea of quantifying cybersecurity risk is important because you're really taking the information that we all take for granted as security engineers and architects and leaders and putting it in terms that the business folks can understand and make good decisions with.
I agree, Mark. But risk management is a term that we're very familiar with. But how do you explain it to an organization where, they may not understand what it means to quantify cybersecurity risk? And how is that different than what everyone is used to?
Sure. Well, I think everybody's used to that graphic of a heat map, right? You have high, medium, and low, red, yellow, green. Where you start to have issues, that's called a qualitative measure. Somebody has defined a category and said if something meets this category, it's high, medium, or low. Or on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 7. But how do you know when you have two 7s? How do you know which one's more important and which one will impact you the most? If you have two things that are both high, how do you know? And you do that by performing quantitative measures or using actual discrete numbers, putting dollar signs to things. So as opposed to having that standard table of just high, mediums, and lows, and everybody knows that security engineer at the company that does some risk management and risk analyses, and everything is critical, and the sky is always falling. The Chicken Little syndrome, I like to call it. To get away from that, it's easier to put each risk into its own category to be able to say, if I don't budget 2% of revenue towards treating this risk, it will cost me $30,000 a year. That is a quantitative measure of risk, which will allow the business owners to be able to make the right decisions and boards of directors to make the right decisions. It's really important to get away from, as much as possible, that subjective rating that changes from person to person.
Excellent. And Chris, how would you shift an organization's mindset toward the quantitative when they're not necessarily familiar with that? And
well, that's a real trick, and that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of us professionals in cybersecurity deal with, and especially with compliance. I mean, shifting an organization's mindset is sometimes a seismic type of exercise, especially during these times of extreme stress and resource strains. I don't have to mention it. Like what we're experiencing in the market right now is quite a stressful time on resources and strains and such. The best ways I've found to change the way of thinking and translate is to essentially translate those initial shifts by employing use cases that are centered around quantitative risk assessment that relate directly back to real ROI, return on investment for the organization. Now, it doesn't always come down to dollars and cents, but sometimes that can make things move. For example, one of the positive aspects of any organization that they'll experience from adding quantitative metrics to their assessment is they get immediate prioritization of critical security components across their IT estate. Um, Definitely when they need it the most, and the ones that need the most attention. That's one of the initial benefits that they're going to get. Common example of that could be, I'm quickly able to determine quantitative risk posed by, in this day and age, the host of security vulnerabilities that might be evident during my security landscape or hygiene assessment phase, in a phase that we have to do during a cybersecurity assessment. Quick prioritization backed by contextual or quantitative intelligence will immediately translate to instant cost savings, and immediate ROI, and it'll speed up those tactical priorities that the organization has to do. I found that by doing this type of translation, it gets buy-in at the highest level of the organization, and the organization can see that immediate return on their investment and their capital, which is almost a scarce commodity at this time. So this is one of the ways that I've always gone about shifting the narrative, I suppose, in terms of what are immediate ways of thinking, or changing the ways of thinking across organizations, when it's trying to do that in a time of crisis is a whole different story. But definitely relating it back to ROI and a business case makes it a lot easier to essentially get buy-in across at all stages and all levels of the organization.
And that's a great point. And Marc, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing organizations when they quantify risk, and how are companies overcoming the challenges?
Well, so Dale, I had an answer worked out to this, but Chris said something that was actually pretty interesting.
Oh,
Um,
I'm sorry.
Tone from the top, I think really uh, fostering a culture, a risk-aware culture within the company is easily and hands down the biggest struggle for an organization. Regardless of how you label the risk and how you classify your risk, I think getting everyone on the same page is often extremely difficult. There are other drivers within a company. There's this quote that's out there. It's been there for a while. Is you put brakes on a car so the car can go faster, not so that you can slow it down. So that being said, security is the brakes, right? Security is there to streamline everything and keep an organization secure as they're being agile. It's not there to be a business disabler. So I think changing that paradigm is probably the most difficult thing. There are some newer organizations and smaller, more modern, and also some legacy ones, some older companies that have really got their hands around that quite well. And then there's everybody else. I think for everybody else, that's the biggest hurdle. The second piece of it, when we're talking about quantifying cybersecurity risk specifically, is data. Financial institutions and insurance companies have been doing this for years, 10, 20, 50, 70, 100 years. You go to your car insurance company and they have actuary tables that show historical trends of events and what the financial impact of those types of events are. If anybody's seen like the farmers insurance commercials on TV, they say we've seen that, and that's how financial institutions and insurance companies have been for a very long time. In cybersecurity, we don't have any of that, at least not to that level of maturity. There are a lot of really good third parties that are now starting to pull that data. There are a lot of advanced security companies that are performing things like incident response and monitoring and logging and things from a technology perspective, where they're starting to pull that data together and be able to analyze it and make correlations. So we're starting to get there. There is a light maybe at the end of the tunnel someday, but we don't have that. What happens in 5 years after a breach? What happens in 10? How do we bring that all together? And without that information, truly quantifying risk is extremely difficult. You're still basing some calculations on some level of subjectivity. But what do you do when you're an organization that you don't have access to any of this data? You want to start. I think that's the big question, right? So there's really three things that someone can do, in my opinion, to get going down that path to the best of their capability. And one is start with a foundation of very knowledgeable folks or individual, that maybe a third party, a contractor, you hire the right person to come in and lay the foundation of your risk management program. Somebody with explicit experience in your vertical, with businesses of your size. Maybe one that's been there, done that, and been through incidents and seen the impact long term. But you want someone to come in and really outline what your risk management program and risk life cycle is going to be. That's not something that you can just go to a boot camp on, read a few slides on, flip through a book on. That's something that takes someone 20 years to really wrap their head around. So I think that's important. B, I mentioned there isn't data available. Share information with industry organizations and be a part of those organizations. For example, in the payments field, the ETA has a lot of great networking capabilities and it provides a lot of opportunity. Every industry, if you're in an industry, of the organizations that you can go to. And if you don't, ask other companies. In the security world versus in the sales or business world, people are willing to share. So have those communications, go to ISACA meetings, IIA meetings, InfraGard meetings. If you're in financial services, FSISAC. I mean, there's so many places that you can go to commune with everyone who's in the same boat as you. And sometimes those folks have a very good perspective that you haven't had. So I think that, be willing to share knowledge within your industry and within the world. And the last thing I would think is, there are technologies and third parties, as I mentioned before, that are really doing a good job of bringing some of that stuff to market. It is highly focused on technology 9 times out of 10. We're not talking about things like necessarily insider risk, geographic and act of God risk if an earthquake rolls through or if there's a global pandemic or something like that, but more towards if I have a vulnerability on my system that's exploitable, what is the likelihood and the ease with which someone could exploit that? There are a lot of utilities out there now today that weren't 5 years ago or even 5 months ago in some cases. There's a lot of good third-party sources, so rely on those and build from there.
Excellent. I agree that quantifying risk is challenging to begin with, but given the cluttered environment that we're dealing with right now, I imagine that it's really difficult when so many businesses are finding themselves in a reactive mode. Chris, can you speak to some of the methods that businesses can take to realize some near-term quick wins in the mission to get a true measure of risk?
Yeah, absolutely, Dale. It's a great question, and Mark hit on quite a few of them there in his previous answer, talking about some of the resources that they can turn to. I think that's the first step in the equation, really, actually. But as I work to implement, when we go to implement this stuff, so turn the tables a little bit. As I work to implement the change across businesses to help improve that state of, get them out of that state of reactivity, as we talked about earlier. I always focus on methods that'll produce, those quick wins and that immediate ROI. But on top of that, of getting, a quick financial result and help encourage the change of that stressed business, one important method that I deal with from an implementation perspective, and I encourage it from the get-go, is to collect and analyze risk from the bottom up rather than the top down. I mean, that sounds really simplistic, but really, when you drill into it, it's a way of analyzing the business that's, it's very in line with what I've done from the beginning, but it's a quick way to realize those small wins. We talk about quick wins, and it's a small way of getting small wins and measuring risk and dividing the analysis up into smaller segments that are more digestible for the company. It's very similar to what we might do during a security assessment, with those distinct phases that are responsible for measuring different stages of risk against the overall security policy. And many companies mix that up. They think that, I'm just going through an exercise again to collect this information and get an answer, but you're really measuring risk. And there are a ton of well-known cybersecurity frameworks that businesses can overlay on top of their cybersecurity infrastructure once it's aligned in segments that'll help further organize how their data is collected and what they can do with it as well. As obvious as this sounds, it's not always a practice by default across the spectrum. I find that it's rarely practiced. And the reasons for this are many. Of course, it's due to the fact, as we mentioned, businesses are in that state of reactivity, and it's almost a permanent state. And sometimes it seems like that from the security professional's perspective, and especially in our current market. So, but if we analyze the risk and the consequences associated with each of those individual security controls that are in each of those phases, those same controls that we need to enforce as practitioners and enterprises in order to prove effectiveness of our security policy, then we'll have more manageable quantitative data. And we can use that to feed into other high-level measurements of security effectiveness. Also, we can help prioritize and remediate those initial and smaller gaps within our systems that tend to start growing across our IT estate. So again, subdividing it into smaller segments is the first implementation practice that I take.
So if you put your cybersecurity posture under the microscope and attempt to quantify the overall risk and security outcomes, are there changes that we should be considering to get a more realistic measure of our security and compliance state?
Yeah, definitely, Dale. There's quite a few, and that's a great segue into a fundamental shift that I think we need to implement immediately, especially considering the current state of our market. With an expanding remote workforce, remote compliance scope, even leading to a larger data threat surface, liability shifts, and legal responsibilities. I really believe that we need to divert from the way we've been applying cybersecurity operational and application frameworks in the past. So in short, I believe we need to apply our frameworks and our risk models sooner in the process of analysis, as opposed to when the threats start to become a concern. So basically, we need to move further up the cyber kill chain of any given framework, and there's many we can use. We need to analyze threat information earlier in this exploit cycle and applying data collection and measurement to threat models that could happen or could become a problem for us as they before they even happen. So we can use our framework data collection as a form of predictive analysis, if you can call it that, which would, it would truly put us in a proactive state. It would take us out of reactivity, and one where we'd have comfort to understand more about the possibility of risk factors that could jeopardize our cybersecurity posture before they become a problem to us. It would help us, prioritize where we need to apply our efforts across our systems. Again, getting that quick win around proactivity, understanding those gaps, having knowledge of highly probable threat patterns that could have a likelihood of being executed against our businesses, or the verticals maybe that we belong to, if we understand. So Dale mentioned, sourcing some of those information sharing. ISACs and whatnot. And that's a brilliant way of gathering that information and finding out what you could be targeted against. So I think this shift really, it's also mirroring what our adversaries are doing as well. In order to exploit a system, adversaries are exercising methods of data collection for a good part of their efforts, a good percentage of their efforts before they actually even execute anything. So we're just mirroring what is naturally occurring and giving ourselves the advantage. And that's the shift I think we need to make to give ourselves that advantage and provide that immediate benefit to quantifying the true risk and measure of our overall security and produce better security outcomes for our business and our cybersecurity posture.
Thank you. It's great to know there's so many available frameworks and resources out there to help organizations determine where, when, and how to quantify security. Have you seen any frameworks that have been particularly effective in helping organizations quantify cybersecurity risk?
Well, that is a big question. So lots of them, and I'm going to stick to the risk management perspective, and I'll let Chris follow up with some of the organizational and tactical frameworks that you can put into place. From the risk management perspective, there are quite a few models. I can't say lots of models because they're just starting to kind of boom over the last couple of years. If somebody wants some homework to be able to go look some things up, for example, FAIR Institute has FAIR, which is Factor Analysis and Information Risk. That is a quantification of cybersecurity risk. It's pretty extensively documented. They have web portals and tools that can assist. It's heavily used in financial institutions. It does require, as I mentioned before, a considerable understanding of the likelihood of certain things happening, which is very difficult to do when you don't have 100 years worth of exploit data. But it is a great start. And there are a ton of mathematical models that can be done. I mean, heck, people have already made Excel spreadsheets and dashboards to support this stuff online. Google is your friend. There are models, Bayesian networks and all kinds of other things that get really deep into, I would say upper graduate mathematics that are probably a little bit much for what you're trying to do. But start with the FAIR framework and see how that treats you for a little while. I think it's important to mention, though, that I've kind of said it a few times, is that while the goal is to quantify the risk, it's to put a dollar amount on it. Without all that data, every single one of these frameworks that you see is still going to have some subjective measure to it. So as you're reading these articles and you're doing some research on it, you are going to see a lot of grandiose claims of we quantify this and qualitative measurement is bad. In cybersecurity, there's always going to be a degree of qualitative measure, that high, medium, low, that scale of 1 to 10. The goal of quantitative analysis is to minimize that whenever possible, so that it doesn't impact the overall risk at the end that significantly. Think of it like if you throw a pebble in the lake, the waves start out real small and then they get real big towards the end. Well, math is the same way. If you start with a foundation that's not accurate, all those little tiny mistakes are going to bubble up and they're going to grow because you're going to be making decisions based on those and then guesses on those. And before you know it, you end up with these very big waves where maybe your risk is not accurate. So it's really important to minimize that subjective nature to help keep those waves small. And then I'll turn it over to Chris. I know you like to talk about the operational side of things quite a bit, and there's a whole bunch of acronyms to talk through.
More acronyms, what we all love in our field. Yeah, I memean, thanks, Mark. I tend to focus on the operational and application frameworks for cybersecurity control guidelines, and the ones that take individual security practices into account. So focus on security controls. And I really agree. Again, Mark is saying that data is paramount here in the effectiveness and the math, relying on math. I mean, I tend to lean towards ones that are a little less subjective as well. There are too many to choose from, really, but I gravitate towards the effective application of some of the frameworks that tend to again have some kind of quantitative feature to them in terms of individual security controls or overall risk. I like to use the CIS CSAT, so that's the acronym heaven, but I mean it's a CIS controls self-assessment tool. It's essentially the CIS CSE boiled into a tool to boil it down to look at risk around individual security controls. I've used the NIST CSF quite a lot. The cybersecurity framework from NIST, again, splitting things into modules and then measuring risk on those. And in banking and finance, I've used the FFIEC cybersecurity assessment tool quite often, again, because it focuses in on risk maturity, giving you a sense of where you're sitting and how at risk you are against individual controls. And then where I turn most often is the PCI DSS. I advocate strongly towards it, and it's not just because I do like it, but it's very prescriptive in application. And because of its prescriptiveness, it's easy to then translate into cybersecurity and security control risk in terms of the gaps that you have around those controls. So all these are based on measuring, or scorecarding how effective one security measure or category is at shoring up your overall security or data policy, again, from an operational standpoint. But I think importantly, it gives us some kind of consumable quantitative measure of risk and our overall posture across the organization. And hopefully it translates into a more tangible, as I said earlier, return on investment quick for the business. Again, going back to that thing of saying you can implement this and get it in there, but you're not going to work with these figures unless it gets buy-in from the organization. So again, I tend to consider all those factors in those operational types of frameworks.
Thank you both for your time today, and thank you to all our viewers. I hope you enjoy the rest of TRANSACT Connect.
Thank you.